He didn't fire a single shot. He didn't send one soldier. And yet, while the world held its breath and braced for catastrophe, a Canadian prime minister that many had already written off may have just executed one of the most precise diplomatic maneuvers in recent memory, quietly outplaying every other leader on the planet while they were still deciding whose side they were on. Here is what happened. For 24 straight days, we watched missiles and smoke rain down across Iran. Oil prices exploded past $113 a barrel. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow choke point through which 20% of the world's entire energy supply flows, was effectively sealed shut. The global economy was teetering. On the edge of a full-scale supply shock, markets were panicking. Shipping companies were rerouting. Western governments were scrambling to figure out whose side they were on and what it was going to cost them to find out. And then this morning, Donald Trump did something unexpected. He posted on Truth Social, telling the world that the United States had been engaged in very good and productive conversations with Tehran. He ordered the military to stand down on planned strikes against Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure. A 5-day pause. Hostilities was now officially underway. Now, here is what I keep coming back to. In the middle of all of it, the bombs, the brinkmanship, the market panic, Canada never fired a single shot, never deployed a single soldier. And while the war was raging, Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand was already in Paris this week, pushing for precisely the kind of diplomatic off-ramp we are now watching take shape in real time. So the question is, how does a country that deliberately stayed on the sidelines end up at the center of the story? And more importantly, how does a prime minister who spent weeks absorbing withering criticism at home for appearing to do nothing suddenly find himself validated by events that unfolded thousands of miles away? What do you think? Does a strategy of quiet back-channel diplomacy actually win in the end? Or does it just look like inaction until events accidentally break your way? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. To understand why this moment matters so deeply for Mark Carney, we have to go back just 4 days. On March 19th, while the war was still raging and oil tankers sat paralyzed at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz, Carney quietly endorsed a joint allied statement. The United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Japan had already signed on expressing what they called a readiness to contribute to appropriate efforts to ensure safe passage through the strait. Canada came on board separately under the G7 foreign ministers framework. Now that language is deliberate. It does not say troops. It does not say warships. It says readiness to contribute. And simultaneously, Anand was in London telling journalists she was heading to Paris too. Pitch her G7 counterparts on what she described as a document of principles for diplomatic off-ramps to end the war. She later walked back that specific phrase to protect the confidentiality of partner conversations, but the intent was crystal clear. Canada was trying to build a diplomatic exit lane while everyone else was either dropping bombs or panicking. What I am about to tell you changes the whole picture because this was not a passive strategy. Reports indicate that Anand had been actively reaching out to Gulf states, countries where Canada has spent years quietly building investment and partnership relationships, not through megaphones, not through press releases, through back channels and private conversations. The kind of diplomacy that only works if you stay out of the military conflict. Canada made that choice early and deliberately. And while Carney absorbed criticism at home for it, the entire situation was playing out in a way that would ultimately validate every single call he made. The conservative opposition tried to frame this as weakness. One commentator wrote that Carney was flip-flopping his way through a crisis and that the Liberals had to ask to be read in on the Hormuz statement after the fact. But that framing misses the bigger picture entirely, being the last G7 nation to formally attach your name to a statement is not the same as being irrelevant. Sometimes arriving last means you have been watching, calculating, and choosing your moment. And now today, March 23rd, with Trump personally announcing a pause in strikes, with oil prices dropping hard the moment that news broke, and with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff confirmed. As the American envoys in these negotiations, the entire diplomatic architecture Canada was building quietly in the background suddenly looks a lot less like weakness and a lot more like foresight. But it gets worse for Carney's critics because there is a domestic political dimension to this story just as significant as the international one. 3 weeks from now, on April 13th, Canada holds federal by-elections in 3 key ridings: Scarborough Southwest in Toronto, University Rosedale, and Terrebonne in Quebec, Scarborough. Southwest has a large Muslim population, a significant immigrant community, and Iranian Canadians who marked no ruse on March 20th, communities that have been tracking every word out of Ottawa for the duration of this war. The fact that Canada kept its hands clean, that no Canadian died in this conflict, that Anand was in Paris, arguing for peace while other governments argued about who gets to use which airbase, that is an enormous political asset in exactly the kind of riding where Carney needs to win. The Liberals chose Doli Begum, former deputy leader of the Ontario NDP, as their candidate there, a high-profile name with deep ties to progressive and immigrant voter networks. This is not a riding where the Liberals were taking any chances. Let me show you the comparison that lays this out cold, because nothing illustrates Carney's position more clearly than what happened to Britain this past weekend. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer is now in serious political trouble at home, not because he joined the war, but because he could not decide whether to join it or not. When U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran first began on February 28th, Trump asked Starmer for permission to use Diego Garcia, the massive Joint US UK airbase in the Indian Ocean, roughly 2,500 miles from Iran. Starmer said no. Then on March 1st, he reversed himself and said yes, but only for defensive strikes. That reversal earned him a public humiliation from Trump, who made clear this was not Winston Churchill he was dealing with. Then Iran fired two ballistic missiles at Diego Garcia. One was intercepted, the other failed in flight, and the British public did not find out from their own government. They found out from American media, conservative leader Kemi Badenoch publicly accused Starmer of covering up the attack, and Iran's own foreign minister went on record saying Starmer was putting British lives in danger by allowing UK bases to be used for aggression against Iran. Three-front political crisis. All at once, from trying to walk the same line Carney was walking, except Carney didn't fall off. Here is what nobody is talking about. The G7 statement Canada endorsed on March 19th was not simply about keeping shipping lanes open. It was a signaling mechanism. It told Tehran, it told Washington, it told global markets that a coalition of major democratic economies was prepared to act collectively to protect freedom of navigation. That kind of multilateral signal creates political cover for de-escalation. It gives Iran something 2.2 when it eventually agrees to talk, because it is not simply surrendering to the Americans. It is responding to a broader international consensus, and Anand's document of principles was designed to give that de-escalation process a working framework, something Iran could accept without appearing to capitulate to Trump. The diplomatic track was far more active than the public posture suggested, and Anand refused to even repeat the phrase document of principles publicly to protect the trust of Canada's negotiating partners. When a country says nothing publicly, it can mean they have nothing to say, or it can mean they are in the room having the most important conversations of the entire crisis, and they know that talking about it would blow the whole thing up. Anand's deliberate silence strongly suggests the second scenario. Now, the oil price dimension. Almost nobody has connected this to the Carney political calculus. Brent crude started the day above $113 a barrel. The moment Trump's announcement hit the wire, prices cratered, falling as much as 11%, with Brent dropping below $100. That is one of the most dramatic single-session moves in global energy markets in years. Canadian consumers were getting hammered at the pump since this war began. And what had Carney been promising? Economic stability, competent management, a government that would not add to the pain if you avoided military entanglement, and prices are now falling, and you are the one who was quietly building the diplomatic off-ramps. You get to be part of that story. And in a country heading into by-elections in 3 weeks, being part of a good story matters enormously. Here is what nobody is talking about. Iran entered these negotiations not from a position of strength, but from a position of exhaustion. Iranian missile stockpiles were significantly depleted over the course of the fighting. Iran had reportedly launched hundreds of ballistic missiles and thousands of drones by early March. That depletion, combined with the systematic destruction of military infrastructure and the elevation of new Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, someone Trump has already publicly dismissed as a lightweight, created conditions where some form of agreement was becoming not just desirable for Tehran, but necessary. Canada's diplomatic push did not create those conditions, but it was timed and calibrated to be available when those conditions arrived, and they arrived today. So where does this go? Because the 5-day pause is not a ceasefire. It is not a deal. Trump has said if talks collapse, the United States will resume bombing. And here is the core uncertainty. Trump says Witkoff and Kushner held direct conversations with a senior Iranian official over the weekend. Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf called the reports fake news, saying no negotiations have taken place. And yet something caused Trump to hold off on striking power plants this morning. There are two possible readings. Either there were genuine back-channel communications that Tehran is denying publicly to avoid looking like they capitulated, or Trump is inflating whatever contact existed to reinforce his deal-making narrative. Both things can be partially true at the same time. What we do know is that oil prices dropped hard, and markets clearly believe something real is happening. This is the part that kept me up last night. Canada under Carney has been explicitly positioning itself as a leader among middle powers countries significant enough to matter diplomatically, but not so embedded in the U.S.-Israel military alliance that they lose credibility as potential mediators. That positioning has real costs. It means getting criticized for not doing enough. It means being the last to sign a statement your allies signed hours earlier. It means your opposition says you have no idea what you are doing while you are actually having the most sensitive conversations of the crisis. But it also means that when someone needs to help build the architecture of a ceasefire both sides can accept without losing face, you are available. You are trusted. Your phone gets answered. Whether voters reward that in Scarborough Southwest, in University Rosedale, in Terrebonne, we will find out in 3 weeks. But in a moment where the UK Prime Minister is being hit from every direction over Diego Garcia, over Trump comparing him unfavorably to Winston Churchill, over British citizens learning about an attack on British territory from American media rather than from Downing Street, Carney looks clean. Not because he did nothing, but because what he did was the right thing, done the right way. Quiet, methodical, diplomatically serious engagement that kept Canadian options open and Canadian soldiers home. Does that kind of quiet competence win votes? Does the oil price drop this morning register as a political win for a prime minister who was working this problem in the background the whole time? I want to know what you think, because this story is not over. The 5 days start now, and what happens at the end of those 5 days, whether Trump resumes strikes or whether we are watching the opening act of a genuine diplomatic resolution to the worst Middle East crisis in a generation, that answer is going to reshape everything. We thought we knew about how power actually works in 2026. Hit the bell icon and subscribe for daily updates.